Chapter 11 The French River. The good weather held, and the spirits of the crew remained high as they paddled the length of the Mattawa. At Talon Falls, the point where the upstream labors ended, the voyageurs held an impromptu celebration. Lalonde started things off by slipping the metal shoe off his setting pole. He needed to save the metal part for the trip back, but the wooden pole would not be needed on the big lakes ahead. Flinging it spear fashion into the pool at the base of the falls, he yelled, "Goodbye, and good riddance to an ugly upstream poling." The crew cheered as the other bowmen tossed their poles aside too. The middlemen splashed each other with their paddles, and one exuberant fellow knocked Pierre's cap into the water. The rugged portage to Trout Lake did little to dampen the spirits of the men. Pierre was amazed at how fast they covered the interlinked series of creeks and beaver ponds that led to Lake Nipissing. The bugs were horrible. Once Pierre opened his mouth to ask Lalonde a question, and he swallowed a cluster of gnats in a single gulp. Lalonde laughed and slapped him on the back, saying, "A little extra meat will do you good, my friend, but leave a few for seed. You don't want to eat up all the breeding stock." As they began their traverse of Nipissing, the men feathered their paddles, turning them flat into the wind on each forward stroke and pulling at a quicker than normal pace without any urging. "What's the hurry?" Pierre turned and asked Charbonneau. "Nipissing is too shallow. Easy to be degrade." "The waves are worse on the shallow lakes?" Pierre asked. Charbonneau nodded. He was in no mood to chat. Pierre knew the meaning of degrade. His father sometimes talked about being wind-bound on Superior and Huron, but the idea of being stuck on an island lake was new to Pierre. They took a pipe stop on the island near the middle of the lake, and Pierre went for a walk. At the edge of a clearing only a dozen paces from the beach, Pierre was shocked to find 3 red crosses made from broken paddles and tied together with rawhide thongs. "It's a sad sight, eh, Pierre?" Pierre was startled by Lalonde, who was looking over his shoulder at the markings. "All that's left is a splash of red paint and a broken paddle blade. A sudden squall, a rock in the bow, and the cold does its trick." Lalonde paused and ran his fingers through his famous hair. "Then the company writes a fancy letter." Pierre knew about those letters. One afternoon, when he was small, he was trying to sneak up on a pigeon in the barn loft with a slingshot. Camille, who was standing at the base of the ladder, yelled to scare the bird away. When he turned to shush his sister, Pierre saw a lone courier riding toward their cabin. "Mother!" he called to the house. "A man's coming!" By the time Pierre climbed down, Mother was standing in the doorway, pale and tight-lipped. Pierre was confused, since strangers were always welcome at their home. Only after his mother gave the horseman directions to a house at the far end of the village did she explain that one of Father's voyageur friends had died. "I've seen the letters they bring, Pierre," she said. "They come with money, and that means nothing. And they flower up dying with grand words like pride and service and duty. They speak of the good of the company, but what it all comes down to is dead and drowned and never, ever coming through that door again." Her voice trailed off as she stared in the direction of the vanishing man. The next morning, the energy of the men reached a new level when they broke camp and started down the French River. Lalonde told Pierre the 70-mile stretch of water that led to Lake Huron would be an easy one-day run. "It's a downhill ride all the way," he said. "We take a few light poles, and the river, she does the rest." Pierre was amazed at Lalonde's enthusiasm. Though he was always positive, his face revealed a special energy for this day. Though Lalonde exaggerated a bit, they did have to paddle at their normal rate. Their speed was more than doubled by the swift of the current. When the brigade got to the first rapids, Pierre saw why his bowman was so excited to be on the French River. McKay and Lapetit climbed onto some boulders that gave them a clear downstream view. "The left-hand channel's clear all the way," Lapetit called out over the roaring of the water. "Get ready for a sleigh ride, gentlemen," Lalonde said. One by one, the canoes rocketed down the white chute. When it was Charbonneau's turn, he allowed for a safe pacing between his craft and the one ahead. Then he yelled, "Pull!" The paddles flashed triple time. Speed was the key to the running white water. If they didn't keep their craft going faster than the water racing beneath the hull, they were left to the whim of the current. Without proper speed, the steersman had no control. Just when the big Montreal was going faster than Pierre ever thought it could, they entered the rapids. Lalonde twirled his paddle above his head and cut loose with a high-pitched yell. "Hang on, Evernuts!" he hollered. Time froze as the bow of the canoe jutted out over the empty air. The four front paddles held their blades a moment above the white spillway that fell suddenly out of the reach. When the bow finally plunged down, the stern lurched skyward, nearly catapulting Pierre out of his seat. "Yeah!" the boy screamed, and the men yelled and whistled, but the roar of the water drowned them out. A fine mist filled the air as Lalonde's ghost-white hair blew straight back off his shoulders, and the hull hurtled down, down, down. A minute later, their quarter-mile run was done. As the grinning canoemen paddled across the pool below the rapids, Pierre's heart was still racing. The whole way down the rapids, he thought of nothing but the red crosses that dotted the waterways behind them. Would they place one here for me, as young as I am, he wondered. "So how was the ride, Pierre?" Charbonneau asked. If anyone had heard him scream, it was Charbonneau. Gulping a deep breath to steady himself, Pierre replied, "It was better than a carry." Charbonneau laughed. "Spoken like a true canoesman. At least we start you out gently." "Gently?" Pierre tried to control his astonishment. "Gentle is the word for this Sioux here," Charbonneau said, motioning with his head as he spoke. "It is a straight and deep ride. That's the easy kind. Even in low water a man can run it blindfolded. But the shallow ones, and the ones with quick twists and turns, those are a dog of another color." "Any tough rapids on the French?" Pierre tried to sound relaxed. "This is mainly clean chutes. Some are a bit tight. We may scrape our gunwales now and then, but there's no tricky parts until we near the outlet. There we have a snaky patch of water that will take some good bow work." He paused. "Not scared, are you?" "This old-timer? Scared?" Pierre scoffed as Charbonneau laughed. The closer they got to Lake Huron, the more the channel narrowed. Just when Pierre thought the river couldn't get any tighter, they shot into the yawning mouth of a gorge that quickly narrowed to only 10 or 12 feet. Sheer rock walls rose up to block out the sun. For 100 yards they skimmed down the rock gut, paddling as room allowed, but mainly giving themselves over to the skill of the foreman's steering. Once their left gunwale scraped against the side and knocked loose a moss-covered chunk of rock. Another time Lalonde had to rap his paddle hard against the cliff to keep the bow from veering too far offline. Pierre edged toward the middle of the canoe, his eyes wide and his mouth open. When they finally shot out into the light, Lalonde called, "Hold the right channel!" The paddlers on the left dug hard. Then Pierre saw one of the tricky turns that Charbonneau had mentioned. At a place where the river momentarily widened into a foaming pool, they had to make a quick right turn. Since their speed threatened to carry them straight ahead into the rocks, the men on the left paddled with all their might. Those on the right obeyed Lalonde's command, "Ship your oars!" and they stopped paddling. The bow veered faster to the right than anyone expected. Lalonde called, "Backwater left!" But their abrupt right turn continued. The long canoe swung directly toward a foam-topped boulder. Lalonde set his paddle against the rock. Pierre heard a sharp crack as Lalonde's paddle snapped in two. "Backwater!" the bowman yelled one more time as he bent to grab a spare blade. Just then, the bow bumped up onto the boulder, and the stern began to swing around. Pierre heard a yell behind him. He turned to see McKay's canoe flying out of the chute above them, bearing straight for their canoe. Lalonde took a quick glance upriver, and then he tried one last, desperate shove against the submerged boulder. His muscles under his loose shirt quivered, but the bow wouldn't budge. The stern swung faster now in the current, and despite the frantic back paddling of the crew, it looked as if they were going to be broadsided when McKay's canoe arrived. "No!" Charbonneau bellowed. Pierre closed his eyes, anticipating the shuddering crunch of a canoe shearing through their hull. When there was no impact, he opened his eyes just in time to see Lalonde leap over the side. Still clinging to the gunwale, the bowman planted both feet on the slippery boulder, grabbed the projecting bow in his hands, and heaved upward. As the front of the canoe came free, the fierce back paddling of the middlemen finally took effect. The stern swung back just as McKay's canoe brushed past, cutting so close that it knocked a paddle out of one of the man's hands. In that same instant, Lalonde lost his footing. Before anyone could extend a hand or even cry out, he was gone. One moment he was there, and an instant later there was only a boulder and a white horsetail of water. Pierre turned to Charbonneau and yelled, "A rope! Get a rope!" But everyone's eyes were already turned downstream, searching for a reason to hope. Dun dun dun.